Drone Racing League, we're trying to build effectively the Formula One of drones. This is a global circuit of racing featuring the best pilots in the world racing drones in interesting and exotic locations. When we first started DRL, one of the first headlines written about us came from USA Today, who declared boldly, "Drone Racing League, the sport of the future." And while that's a great compliment, I'm here to tell you today a little bit about the reality of trying to build a futuristic sport, and about the challenges that we face similar to technology in which unrealistic headwinds create an unrealistic set of expectations about what these sports are going to be like when people watch them. In other words, I'm going to tell you about how the sport of the future might be killed by the past. So first, what is drone racing? So FPV, or first-person view drone racing, involves taking very fast drones in which you mount a camera on the front, and that camera broadcasts a video feed to a pair of goggles worn by a pilot. This allows the pilot to see what the drone is seeing, and it's like sitting in the cockpit of the drone. And this allows for very high-speed racing through complex three-dimensional courses. So this sport has all the thrills and speed and crashes of auto racing, but adds the elements of three-dimensionality and flying robots. Interest in this sport has been exploding. This is the Google Trends for the search term drone racing over the last few years. So, like most entrepreneurs, when I started working on DRL, I sketched out my idea on a cocktail napkin, and I went around to see potential investors and supporters to get them rallied behind my idea. And I would start talking about drone racing, and they would immediately start talking about these elaborate visions of what drone racing was going to be like. And I would look at my cocktail napkin and think, you get all that from this? But the reality was that I wasn't just encountering overactive imaginations or hype. I was encountering a deeply ingrained set of expectations about what drone racing was going to look like when it came to real life. So where do these expectations come from? Well, the reality is they come from sci-fi movies and video games. I mean, if you think about it, we have been rendering in glorious, photorealistic HD perceptions of what futuristic sports were going to look and feel like for decades in some of the most influential forms of media available. Now, this phenomenon of expectations and hype is well known in other areas. So there's something called the Gartner Hype Cycle, which describes how visibility on the y-axis and time on the x-axis plays out when there's a technology trigger. So a new technology is announced, expectations start to mount, eventually reaching what they call the peak of inflated expectations. And then people begin to realize that this technology isn't going to live up to these expectations, and it falls into what they call the trough of disillusionment. Now, eventually, that technology gets appreciated for its current functional value versus the expectations, and gets integrated in society in what they call the plateau of productivity. Futuristic sports go through a similar phenomenon with some notable differences. One, as I've mentioned, people have been watching these movies and playing these video games for decades at this point. So you pretty much start at that peak of inflated expectations, as I encountered when I went out to try to pitch DRL for the first time. Second, sports are fundamentally a form of entertainment. So when you drop into that low visibility trough of disillusionment, it can be the death of your sport. And you could end up in what one Gartner researcher calls the trash heap of failures. So the hope for a new sport is that you can bridge that gap, that you can come off the peak of inflated expectations slowly enough to reach the point where you can begin genuinely building fans, which will allow for a sustainable sport going forward. Now, I recognize that there are forms of technology in particular that are subjected to the same thing. So things like VR and robots have been portrayed in film and movies for a long time. The difference is, of course, that those are functional products that will on some level be evaluated on their functional merit. So if you think about it, if I get a new robot and it's not C-3PO, I'm a little disappointed, but it can go get my coffee and that's a useful thing, eventually I'm going to say, okay, this is a great thing, I'm going to start using it. But as I've said, sports are a form of entertainment. They are competing directly with all those computer-generated images for the hearts and minds of viewers who would be their fans. So I'll give you an example of how this plays out. We'll take a different futuristic sport, robot boxing. So robot boxing, where do the expectations for robot boxing come from? Well, they come from things like Real Steel. This is a movie in which multi-story robots wail on each other like prize fighters, and video games that show these highly dynamic and elaborate robot fights. And this is the reality. This is something called the Robot Combat League. It was launched in 2013, and on the surface is a lot like Real Steel, multi-story robots wailing on each other until one of them fails. However, the reviews of this were incredibly harsh. If you go to the IMDb page for the Robot Combat League, you see things like, it was such a disappointment. nothing like what I thought it would be. We were promised fighting robots and got these flimsy robots held up by frames. People were expecting real steel. And if you really dig through the language of these comments, it's all about expectations. It's what you thought it would be. It's what you were promised. It's what you were expected. Now, there's one lone dissenter on the IMDb page whose comments I liked a lot. This person talks about the fact that they say, hold on, this is a great and interesting form of entertainment in its own right. Sure, it's not real steel yet, but it's the birth of something new and exciting. Give it some time. Be patient. Well, the reality is the marketplace isn't that patient, and the Robot Combat League canceled in less than a year. So what about drone racing? Where do the expectations for drone racing come from? Well, when I talk about drone racing, people talk about the speeder bike scene in Star Wars. They talk about spaceships flying around. They talk about the light cycles in Tron. They'll talk about their favorite video games they played growing up, like Wipeout and F-Zero. But more than anything else, when I talk about drone racing, someone brings up pod racing. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, pod racing was a scene in Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, in which these pods raced around the desert at incredible speed. But let's take a step back. What is pod racing really? Pod racing is a several-minute, entirely computer-generated, multi-million-dollar scene in a movie. When I was getting ready for this presentation, I downloaded a clip of pod racing, and I watched it. It was about 15 seconds long. And in those 15 seconds, there are 10 different camera angles, including 4 that would be practically impossible to replicate in real life. So that tells you, even if you had actual pods sitting ready to race around the desert, it would be very hard to create anything that looked or felt as compelling as what's portrayed in this movie. And so when I talk about drone racing, people immediately go to this image of pod racing. And the reality looks something more like this. And I can assure you, my friends, this is not Star Wars. And it is very natural that people will see this and be disappointed versus their expectations. And it played out. Several of the first very high-profile drone racing events got very tough comments. These are comments from a couple news articles that cover them. They talk about events stumbling. They talk about them plagued with technical problems. They emphasize the fact that the viewers couldn't follow the action. They even talk about drones just spontaneously combusting in the air. So people have been disappointed versus their expectations of what they thought they were going to get when drone racing first came out. So we knew we had a pretty significant challenge going into creating DRL. And so we took a step back and we created 4 rules for ourselves to think about as we brought drone racing to life. The first one was that a strong start is key. This is true in racing as it is in creating a new sport. So we took our time. DRL spent the better part of a year in stealth mode. We did 6 different racing events entirely in private, and it allowed us to refine and improve and perfect our product before we brought it to life. Rule 2, embrace the expectations. People have been watching these movies and playing these video games for quite literally decades. You're not going to overcome that expectation, so you have to be aware of it. You have to recognize it. So at DRL, we think a lot about how to embrace those expectations, and I'll give you a small example. We refer to our races as levels, as in level 1, level 2, a direct reference to the video game analogy that people come up with all the time. We take raw spaces like this, and we transform them into immersive 3D worlds, complete with elaborate gates demarcating the course. And we've invested a lot in new novel cinematography techniques that allow us to keep the drones large and in frame, allowing people to follow the action of the racing and see them the way they expect them to be when they think of things like spaceships flying around. So, rule 3, invest in technology. If you're going to be the technology-enabled sport of the future, your technology had better work. So at DRL, we've chosen to build all of our own technology from the ground up. We design and build our own drones right down to the circuit boards inside of them, and we designed a complete radio frequency system to control the drones when they're in the air. This gives us several advantages. The first main one is that it allows us to ensure seamless operation of our technology. The second is it allows us to make technology that is particularly adapted to our sport. So you can see here one of our drones. We cover them in bright colored LED lights that allow you to tell the drones apart. You can tell if the red drone or the blue drone is leading the race quite easily. The other thing it allows us to do, particularly with our radio frequency technology, is build huge, elaborate courses that weave through spaces in a way that no off-the-shelf radio system would ever allow you to do. Fourth rule, focus on the sport. All the other things I've talked about today help us a lot with how we come off that expectation curve as gently as possible. But the reality is building a sustainable sport is about getting genuine fans engaged and interesting. It's why we've invested so heavily in things like the format of our events, the rules of our races, and getting the very best pilots in the world to compete. Our sports content that we create so that we can share our races with the world, think about this a lot. And our goal is to bring the full drama of the sport to the audience. So we think a lot about how to show it in just the right way so that you can follow the action, the results, and the strategy of the sport through our careful use of cinematography, on-screen graphics, and race commentary. So what have the results of this been? Well, reality is it's very early. We've only released our first race, which is Level 1 Miami Lights. But we've been really pleased with the results. 865,000 people tuned into one of our primary channels to watch the actual racing event. We got 165,000 social followers in less than 4 weeks' time. Over 40 million people around the world viewed some content from this race on both our primary and digital channels. And the statistics most important to us, 96% of the feedback was positive on channels like YouTube. So, what was the anecdotal feedback like? We get comments like, this is the only sport that I know I love watching. This is awesome. This is the future. This is my new favorite sport. Stop what you're doing and watch. I'm hooked. One of my favorites. I'm 61 years old, and this new sport is fantastic. And then the most important cultural barometer, Kevin Jonas, 1/3 of the Jonas Brothers, tweeted us to say, my official life goal is to be a world champion drone racer at Drone Racing League. Okay, I'm in. So I've talked to you today a bit about expectations and about new sports. So we're going to conclude with a short video. It's a preview of our second race. It's called Level 2 LA Apocalypse. And I'll allow you to judge for yourself whether you think your expectations will either be met or not met by this futuristic sport. Thank you very much.